All right, so I'm going to talk to you about 3D technology, or actually maybe a little bit about 3D and a little bit about technology. So we'll start with 3D. So this may sound sophisticated, but in fact we're all really familiar with three-dimensional world. That's this one. The world we live in is a three-dimensional world. We also are surprisingly familiar with virtual worlds. Computers have been able to create virtual worlds and present them at least through a 2D screen for years. We call these games. And many of us have probably played some of these games and are pretty familiar with them. But new technology is starting to blur the lines between the real and the virtual. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about several of those technologies today. But first I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about how I view the development of new technologies, because these are all pretty new technologies and in different stages of that development. So the earliest stage of technology development is the experimental stage. You'll find like one cobbled together thing in a research lab someplace. And if you're lucky enough to be a researcher in that lab, then you can use it and you can experience sort of wonderful things that nobody else in the world can try. I was fortunate enough to be in that situation for a while when I was a graduate student working on new forms of graphics hardware. And it was years before anyone else had anything similar, and so I was able to do some new and amazing things that are still interesting today, in part because nobody else could do them then because they didn't have the equipment to do so. The second stage is when, for me, is when they are expensive. You can buy the new technology product, but it's expensive and rare. And so you might find one of them in a company or one in a university lab as sort of a shared resource. So they would be pretty unusual at that point. The third stage, you will maybe have some in individual homes, some in individual faculty labs, so maybe several in a company. Someplace between the last stage and this one, I have a great example, which is color printers. So when I was a graduate student, we had a dye sublimation color printer. And this was an amazing thing. You could print like full-size sheets of paper that looked like color photos. And wow, that's, can you imagine being able to print color photos? Well, obviously today you can, but at the time it was pretty unusual. And, okay, it was slow, and it took 4 full-page pieces, full paper-sized sheets of ribbon to make a single color print. But you could do it, and so it was really, just cool to be able to make color prints. So the third stage, they're still maybe somewhat rare, but they're around pretty commonly. And what starts to matter more is not just, hey, I can make a color print, but what is it you're printing? What are you trying to show me? And then the final stage, you find them everywhere. And that's certainly the place where color printers are today. So a few years ago, I was organizing a conference. And we actually went down to the local office supply store and bought a color printer so we could print out badges on site. And at the end of the weekend-long conference, we gave the thing away to a participant who happened to be local because that was cheaper than shipping one that we had at home all the way out to the conference across the country and back again. It was easier to go just out to the office supply store and get one and then give it away at the end. And really, if you think about 3D printers now, you don't think about 3D printers now. Right? I mean, I have one at home. I've got one in my office. There's one in my lab that my students use. And if they stop working, you stick them on the top of a shelf someplace and forget about them. So that's sort of the life cycle, I would say, of technology. And I could have used phones or HDTV or some other technology as an example of this sort of cycle. But now back to 3D. So let's look at a couple of examples of 3D technologies through this lens. So the first one I'm going to talk about is 3D printing. So 3D printing is probably the most advanced of the technologies that I'm going to discuss today. And back in 1989, I was in school. I was an intern for a summer at Kodak, and they had a stereolithography 3D printer. Nobody had 3D printers back then. And so this thing had this like plastic resin that was sort of goo-like that would harden when you painted over it with a UV laser. And so you kind of paint one layer and then move a platform down, squeegee a little bit more glue over it, paint another layer, just over and over again until you have printed your 3D object. And so I still have a 3D object from that printer. And I have absolutely no idea what this thing is. But that didn't matter because, hey, it's 3D printed. I mean, who cares what it is? It's something that didn't exist before, was a purely virtual object that got 3D printed. So that's like the earliest stages of development for 3D printing. 3D printers have come a long way since then. So 3D printers now, the most common technology you'll see, heats up plastic, extrudes it out into a thin thread that hardens almost immediately. And so it draws layer upon layer of 3D plastic. And so these are much more durable, much less expensive, and you start to find them not just a single one in a company someplace or in a university, but you see several in universities. You start to see them not just in companies and universities, but in libraries, in maker spaces, in places that regular people can find them. Even in, some people even have them in their homes. So when they're new, 3D printers, it's enough to say, yeah, here's my doodad. Isn't that great? But now we're in a place where it matters much more what it is that you 3D print than it does that it was 3D printed. So for example, this is a tactile graph. This is from a project by Dr. Amy Hurst at UMBC. And so this is a graph that's readable by someone who's blind. The labels on the axes are printed in Braille, raised from the surface, and the lines themselves are printed raised from the surface as well. So if you were blind, you could definitely read this graph and come to understand it in the way a sighted person might understand the graph printed on paper. So that's using the technology for a purpose, not just oh, this is a 3D thing. And it's further evidence that these things are becoming much, much more common. Here's an object that was designed by a third grader in a school in Baltimore as part of another project with Dr. Hurst. And so this was a project about reimagining the space where they lived. And I don't know about you, but when I was in third grade, if we had been doing a similar project, I'm pretty sure we would have been using clay or maybe paper and pencil. But today it's possible to imagine that a third grader might be doing something to be 3D printed. And so that really says that technology has come along quite a ways. The second technology that I'm going to talk about is virtual reality. And so where 3D printers take virtual objects and bring them into the real world. Virtual reality takes 3D objects and makes them seem real. And so I mentioned games as being sort of an example of virtual reality already. And so that is pretty much true. I mean, you can imagine if you were in a game world using either the controller or keyboard, you might go through a door, down a hall, turn a corner, go a little bit, and through another door, and know that you're going to end up back in the same room that you came out of, even having never done it before. Because you know how the world works, and you understand the space that you're in. And the difference with virtual reality or VR is that is the addition of tracking. So through tracking devices, the computer knows in essentially 60, not just 3D. It knows 3D, where are you, and 3D, where are you looking. And so given where you are and where you're looking, it's able to present to you the view that you should see in that virtual world if you were looking in that direction. And the difference that makes is that it allows you to become immersed in that 3D world, for you to believe that it's real. People who do work in this area call this a sense of presence. So it's not unusual for people in VR scenarios to reach out and try and put their hand on a table that's really not there, or to feel a sense of vertigo on the edge or a drop-off that they know doesn't really exist. And this is that sense of presence. And so when it comes to VR technologies, there's a variety of ways you can do it. There's one that's called fish tank VR that you can do with a flat screen if you have the tracking technology. Basically, you look through the screen, and it's like you're looking into a fish tank. is not really very immersive, but it does give you that sense of the stuff inside there is 3D, you're just not in the middle of it. The next version to talk about is what's called a cave technology, where we put screens around you. And so this image up here is a system that's being built at UMBC through a grant by Dr. Jian Chen. That will be a cave-like system. So screens all around you, and wherever you, it knows where you are, it knows which way you're looking, and whichever way you look, it presents the right view to you. The third kind, and what's becoming the most common kind, are your VR goggles. And so these you put on your head, and there's screens in front of each eye, and whichever way you look, it adjusts those screens to show you the right thing. Now, of course, it's not doing that to me right now because it's not plugged in. But it can give you that convincing sense of presence. So VR has actually been around for quite a while. So it's a pretty advanced stage of development at this point. Not quite as far as 3D printers, but the earliest VR systems were developed in 1968 at the University of Utah. By Ivan Sutherland, who's sometimes called the father of computer graphics. I first started doing VR in the 1990s when I was a graduate student at the University of North Carolina. And there we had a few, we called them head-mounted displays, we call them VR goggles now, that were very expensive commercial systems, and a bunch that were completely experimental, built by other researchers there. So one of a kind built there. More recently, for like the past decade, I have been doing some work in a cave system, or with a cave system, at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. All of these are definitely in the expensive and rare variety. But recently, we've started to see VR goggles reach into the less expensive and less rare, so where you can actually imagine having one yourself. A recent survey said 12% of Americans plan to buy a VR system sometime soon. HTC and Oculus have ones that you can buy for $600 to $800. So something that is admittedly expensive still, but more getting to the point where 3D printers are. There's also less expensive options. So we have like this Google Cardboard cell phone holder. Can present a similar experience, although not quite as compelling as the full VR goggle system. So when I was a grad student working on those early systems, I helped develop a demo that was one of our most popular ones, where you could paint in 3D space. On the Vive headband or goggles. There's a very similar demo called Tilt Brush, and I got to try it somewhat recently, and it's still a hell of a lot of fun. You definitely should try that out. And the fact that I'm saying that is a sign that it's still in the point where, that this technology is still in a point where just getting to try it is a novelty. So the third kind of technology I'm going to talk about is 3D scanning. So this is a picture of our 3D scanning rig at UMBC. This is 94 cameras, which can fire simultaneously to take 94 photos of a subject. So this is 94 itty-bitty little photos of me standing in the rig. And so the way this works is then some software will find common features in the photos, and triangulate to figure out, well, if those things represent the same thing in both pictures, where would the point that feature have been in 3D space, and where could the cameras have been for all these photos to actually make any sense? And that's actually a super hard computational problem. And so it takes like a shutter click to take 94 photos. It takes several hours and a computer that would make most gamers drool to actually turn that into a 3D model. But at the end of the day, we can actually get a full 3D model that you can stick into a virtual world. So our system was built for us by a company called Direct Dimensions. And their primary business is doing scans of actors for movie effects. Now we're planning on doing some other things in the way of mechanical engineering problems or assistive technologies, but the basic idea is the same, that, that building a system like that can create these 3D spaces. So it's not hard to imagine these things eventually finding their way into libraries and makerspaces. They're not there yet. Now you can get technology that's similar to this right now. So with a single camera, even a cell phone camera, and there are apps, including apps for your phone, you can take a whole bunch of photos of a static object and reconstruct 3D from it. But being able to construct sort of the complex 3D objects that are rigged like this allows, still probably a few years away from making it into the makerspaces, but I think it will get there. As it is right now, companies like Direct Dimensions, there's a few companies like that, they generally build their own systems. It's only just possible to start buying something like this for yourself when you didn't actually build it from scratch. And when you do, admittedly, it looks like somebody else's experimental thing. Sort of cobbled together out of cameras and stands. It doesn't really look like a professional product like a color printer does yet. But I think in a few years we'll be there. So finally, I'd like to talk about the convergence between these technologies. So if you stop and think about what you can do with these free technologies together, we can scan physical objects and stick them into a virtual world to experience together with those virtual imagined objects. We can take virtual objects and print imagined objects that never existed in the real world and print them out. Maybe to get some practice before we go into the virtual world again in order to better achieve something in the virtual world. We can, say, scan a physical object, make some modifications to it, and then in the virtual environment, and then reprint it to be physical again. So this might be particularly exciting for assistive technologies for people with disabilities. Scan an object, scan the person, make some changes, reprint something customized for them. Print objects in new materials that they didn't originally come in. And so we can go sort of into and out of the virtual world, which brings me to, of course, the 3D print of the model of myself. You might be able to distinguish a few differences between the 3D print and my physical presence on this stage, but it's a pretty decent likeness, I think. So I managed to make it. I managed to make it the whole talk without stepping on the microphone until now. So I managed to make it the whole way through now without mentioning science fiction. But I have to say that I can feel the world of holodecks and replicators on the horizon, and I can't wait. Thank you.